about one of my relatives, Joe Dagastine. Joe's children, Jim, Joe, and Brenda, regret they cannot be here today due to distance and health issues. We're going to try to FaceTime with his son, Jim, so if it works, hopefully you'll get to see this. Joseph John Dagastine was born on June 24, 1913, to Italian immigrant parents, Pasquale and Maria Dagastine, and he was raised on Strawberry Avenue in the section of Port Norris, known as Little Italy. Although there were 16 children in his family, only 10 survived. His 4 sisters, Elizabeth, Phil, Francis, and Lena, and his 5 older brothers, Tony, Lou, Les, Sam, and John. No one knows John, it's really Froggy. So you probably all know Froggy, right? And that's another story. No one knows him as John. The only one that called him John was his oldest sister, Phil. But no one else knew. In fact, people used to go up and say, Mrs. Froggy, when they would see his wife. Joe married his sweetheart bride, Emma Ricky, and together they were blessed with 3 children, Joe Dagastine and Brenda Robbins, both of Georgia, and James Dagastine of Morrilton, New Jersey. They have 9 grandchildren and many great-grandchildren. Joe and Emma resided in the center of town behind Dagastine's Friendly Service Station. And for those of you who did not know his wife, Emma was as petite as Joe was tall, broad, and strong. And they were lovebirds until the end. I can still picture Aunt Emma sitting as close as she could to Uncle Joe in the car when they traveled. So during this presentation, I'm going to refer to Joseph informally as Joe and sometimes as my Uncle Joe. So the town of Port Norris, as all of you who have had any connection with Port Norris knows, it's synonymous with nicknames for many of its residents, both living and past, and Joe was no exception. To keep with the tradition, not breaking any of his rules, he was known to the Ricky family, which was his wife's family, as Big Dag. Okay, you can figure out Big and Dag for Dagastine, including his own children. In fact, when we were just up with Jim last week talking about Uncle Joe, he referred to him as Big Dag, not Dad, but Big Dag. Commercial Township has a resident scarecrow known as Big Dag, who often revisits the town of Port Norris during the Halloween season. So if you're in Port Norris sometime and you see this huge scarecrow with bib overalls and a large straw hat, that's Big Dag. Family and friends would call him Joe, of course, but our family had an unusual name for him. It was the name Five. Where the name came from and why he had the name of Five is anyone's guess. But there is a family, a very close friend, who's actually here today, who related this story to me. Her Aunt Emma married my Uncle Joe, and we lived around the globe, which was Strawberry Avenue, James Moore Road, and then back down to Dagastine Road. So one day she said to me, Mary Linda, I know all of your aunts and uncles. Who are you talking about? Who is Uncle Bob? And I simply replied, Uncle Joe. Not wanting to add to anyone's confusion, his brothers and a few male relatives on his side of the family called him Buick. Your guess is as good as mine, but it probably has something to do with the Buick automobile and the cars he drove. For the most part, people who knew Joe knew him as a farmer who wore a white shirt and sometimes bib overalls and a large straw hat. Now, this straw hat would help him when he was in a discussion and trying to get his point across. He would take his hat off, he would put it back on. He would take it off, he would put it back on. And he did that throughout his discussion. He farmed with his brother-in-law, Gus Nicoli, for a number of years. And he had a number of hats. So he would put on his lumberjack hat, and he and Gus would go out to cut oyster steaks for the local oystermen. And Dick, I will put it up here on the table, brought in a tag that says Joseph J. Dagastine Oyster Steaks. They would work out in the woods cutting down the trees in the morning, and sharpened their stakes outside behind the house later on. As time went on, Joe partnered with his other two brother-in-laws, Sam and Anthony Rickey, farming acreage on land in Down Township. Later, he became a self-employed farmer. And if most of you know, Joe had a love for his faithful companions, his dogs, and they traveled with him as he would drive to and from the farms. When his son Joe moved to another state, he could not take his dog Orzo with him, so Uncle Joe adopted the dog. Now, Orzo didn't like to ride like most dogs do. He rode on the top of the roof of Uncle Joe's pickup. Being afraid that he might fall off, Uncle Joe glued carpet onto the top of the roof of his pickup so that the dog would have extra footing and not fall off. Now, he's riding down to his farm early in the morning, and Orzo begins to bark, and naturally, as Orzo barks, all of the other dogs start barking and following. Now, this is not the only hat that Joe wore. To some, Joe was your employer, whether working on the farm or in the commercial township school system. Joe served for 18 years on the local school board, holding various positions throughout his term. If you were an employee of Commercial Township Municipal District, Joe was regularly seen around the community, for he served as a township committeeman for 12 years, and 6 as mayor. And apparently he wanted people to vote for him because he had a bumper sticker. He continued to be involved with the township as a member of the local welfare board and the zoning board of adjustment. And Dick Smith shared with us today this bumper sticker. We could say that he was a jack of all trades. For a period of time, he wore the hat of a house mover, using large house jacks on a flat trailer, relocating houses from one part of Port Norris to another part of the township. There's a little known fact about Uncle Joe which I would like to share with you today. Not many people know. In his younger years, he wore the hat of a tailor. Once married, in the front room of his home on Market Street, which would be a typical living room, that was his tailor shop. He would hem clothing, make repairs, sew on buttons, and his job continued throughout his whole life, especially repairing and making adjustments for family members. His son Jim has his sewing machine with a wooden cabinet to remember his endeavors. Joe was a lifelong member of St. Anthony's Catholic Church, volunteering whenever he needed, and he assisted other men in the church building the hall, the St. Anthony's Hall. As hard as he worked, he loved to have fun and share in good times. And while serving on the township committee, he would volunteer to sit on the dump tank. There's a picture up here on the table of, it must have been like one of the commercial township celebrations at the fire hall. A picture of Committeeman Ed Cox, Stanley Storms, Clerk Eugene Eichelberger, and Dave Brown, all dressed up for the occasion. Now, some of you may remember in our younger years being part of a sled train gliding through the town in the evening on snow-covered streets. Being pulled, do I hear some people saying I do? Being pulled by Uncle Joe on his farm tractor. His son Jim told us he would have 2 long hay ropes and would use a piece of wood to hold each sled that was connected to these ropes. And inevitably, someone's sled would hit a patch of thawed snow and part of the sled train would break off and Joe would have to repair it. Now, rumor has it, once the town kids would go home for the evening, Joe would pull the adults on the sled. Now remember, the streets back then were not salted, so the roads were really packed for a nice sled ride. During a party, Uncle Joe has always had fun, and at a party at our church hall, Uncle Joe and Aunt Emma were dancing the polka. He would literally lift Aunt Emma up off of her feet, put her down, and stomp down so hard on that floor it seemed as if the floor was shaking. Uncle Joe had a humorous side also, and I would like to share a story that circulates through our family periodically. One that is as funny the last time you heard it as the first time you heard it. So as the story goes, Joe had another dog named Sonny Boy. Sonny Boy was always by his side. And if you knew Uncle Joe when he was talking, he would always point his finger. So one evening, Joe was up at Sal DeGrazio's store across from the Catholic Church. Now, several men always gathered in the evenings, and I hear people laughing already, so they already know the story. Several people would gather there in the evenings to discuss the day's adventures. So a local resident stopped to make a purchase, and I'm not going to say any names, but some people know who he may be. And when he walked by Joe's pickup, he claimed the dog nipped at him. So the man went into the store and he approached Joe and he said, "Joe, your dog, he bite me." Uncle Joe, with a serious face, said, "My dog? No, he wouldn't bite you." When the man insisted, Joe said, "Let's go out to the truck." So once they were out at the truck, Uncle Joe called Sonny Boy to come over and pointing his finger and shaking said, "Sonny Boy, this man said you bit him." The dog began to whine. Joe turned to the man and said, "Sonny Boy said he didn't bite you." Oh, it gets better. The man replied, "Well, he's a blankety blank liar." And to this day, we still laugh at this story, and we can just picture, and it actually did happen. Uncle Joe did find time to rest from all his hours of hard labor, and I'm going to give you a little clue. In fact, weekdays at 1 p.m., Joe could be found in his recliner. Now picture this big, tall, broad, strappy man. He could be found in his recliner watching his favorite soap opera, All My Children. He would sit there every day with Aunt Emma. Farm or no farm, he needed that break. For those, and Joe would frequently visit the guys at the station or at Sal's. And anyone living near the premises could hear that friendly discussion, aka argument, and that Dagastine voice. And for anyone who knows the Dagastines, it was loud and clear. Uncle Les told us that the arguing began when his brothers were young, and they would be out working in the fields. He said hours of hoeing and picking were really boring, so they passed the time away. They started to pick arguments with each other. But you know, they argued, but they usually were all saying the same thing. So for those that knew Uncle Joe, I hope this brings back some good memories. For those of you who had not had the opportunity to meet Joe, this is a small window of who he was. A man whose smile could light up a room and know that he cared about you. A man dedicated to his community, family, friends, and church. As the song goes, just a plain and simple Joe, but with a big Dagastine voice. When his life on earth ended in June 1996, he became a legend that will live on forever.